It's interesting, right? Because people in my generation, we grew up under the threat of nuclear war. It was like, it was drilled into us at an early age that this was sort of the primary fact of our existence globally, that there was this thing hanging over us that could happen at any time. And it was something that ordinary people really did think about a lot. I mean, you think about pop culture going back in the 80s, it was clearly on the minds of everybody, you know, from Prince 1999 to 99 Luftballons to the day after, to, you know, God knows what else. We thought about nuclear war. I mean, that was a thing that was, you know, it was very much an area of concern, particularly on the left, right? That was an area where,
yeah, there were like nuclear disarmament protests, or like even like nuclear power protests in the 80s, correct?
Absolutely, there was a big movement for that everywhere. You know, not just about nuclear weapons, but nuclear power, right? Remember the 3 Mile Island, the China Syndrome, you know, Chernobyl, right? There was tremendous anxiety about nuclear weapons, and rightly so, because as we've subsequently found out, there were so many near misses and accidents that happened. And this was one of the things that I learned, because I was in Russia at the time. They were declassifying all these documents where we found out that, you know, but for some lieutenant in 1983 in the Soviet Army, that there might have been a launch.
It was completely unexpected, as such things usually are. The siren sounded very loudly, and I just sat there for a few seconds, staring at the screen with the word "launch" displayed in bold red letters. A minute later, the siren went off again. The second missile was launched, then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. The computers changed their alerts from launch to missile strike. There were no rules about how long we were allowed to think before we reported a strike. But we knew that every second of delay took away valuable time that the Soviet Union's military and political leadership needed. And then I made my decision. I would not trust the computer. I picked up the telephone handset, spoke to my superiors, and reported that the alarm was false. But I, myself, was not sure until the very last moment. I knew perfectly well that nobody would be able to correct my mistake if I had made one.
Boris Yeltsin also made a decision in 1992 within a couple of minutes. The systems had mistaken, I think it was a Finnish or a Scandinavian weather rocket or something like that for a launch, and they were about to hit us.
I believe during the Cuban Missile Crisis also there was a nuclear submarine that disobeyed protocol and didn't launch when they should have.
Wow. Yeah, well, I mean, and that doesn't even take into account all the accidents, right? Like, you know, nuclear warheads rolling overboard and ships and falling to the bottom of the ocean, or
yeah, I read one article recently where you know, somebody was recounting something that happened at a U.S. missile site where like the missile had launched, you know, or like partially launched, but like the warhead came off of it or something. So just absolute madness.
Yeah, no, there have been. I have a friend who's in the former head of the Boston chapter of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. So it's a big sort of anti-nuclear thing, and so I hear a lot about these stories about these near misses. But that was a big thing for people of our generation, and so was the fear of the kind of loss of civil liberties and freedom, because that was what was represented by the Soviet Union. Our great enemy was so supposedly deficient in those areas, and that was why we worked so hard to preserve and celebrate our civil liberties. And it seems like the generation that came after the Gen Xers, they were raised kind of in this era of no longer being afraid of war, no longer being afraid of nuclear conflict, and also no longer being so worried about civil liberties. And I think that this began with, there was a time early in, you know, the war on terror when I think many liberals were really mobilized to try to protect civil liberties, but it's been gradually eaten away over the last 20 years or so, to where it's just not so much a consideration in the mainstream anymore. And it's a fascinating development, very sad, but it's amazing. I'd be curious to hear what you think about that. I mean,
well, I mean, so I am a millennial. I came after Gen Xers, and yeah, I mean, I think that on the nuclear war front, like, again, I think it's all very like movie based, right? Like, I think about like Terminator 2 or Terminator 3, where there's like the big nuclear war scene in the end. But like, as far as millennials being anti-war, I think that they were to a large degree during the mid 2000s. During like the heyday of the Daily Show and Stephen Colbert, when he used to do like a satirical character, and the younger folks were very anti-war and marched against the Iraq War. But then again, it just goes to Barack Obama. Like, over the course of the Obama administration, liberal values seemingly got inverted, where everyone started supporting the things that they were against a few years earlier.
Yeah, like assassination, right? We were against that at one point, I seem to remember, and then suddenly we were okay with it. And throwing habeas corpus out, like that was a problem, and then it wasn't. And even torture. I mean, the way it was quasi celebrated, in movies like Zero Dark 30, which I thought was a great movie, but it had such a strange message to it, where the idea was, and I'm not even sure that the movie was factually correct, but the whole idea that yes, sometimes we have to torture people in order to get the bad guys. I think that's a point of view that is shared by a lot of people. And so the revulsion that we had initially about, bringing torture in, back into some kind of respectability, that's all gone now. We got over that feeling of revulsion towards all these developments way back in the early Bush years. And yeah, now it's just normal to people, along with censorship and all these other problems.
On the subject of nuclear war movies, did you ever watch Oliver Stone's interview with Vladimir Putin?
I didn't. I've been
he actually
to.
So he asked Putin if Putin has ever seen Dr. Strangelove, and Putin says no. So he shows it to them, and they actually watched Dr. Strangelove
together.
Yeah. I personally think that there should be like just a
mandatory
nuclear
showing.
Yeah, like a nuclear war movie night where like everybody has to kind of watch the movies and think about them and think about the consequences. Because again, I think that we have just moved so far away from it where people either think that they would survive it or I don't know. It's just like it's not in people's minds what that really means. Just the end of civilization.
Right, and I wrote about this in an article a little while ago, basically about how the Gen X generation, we grew up with this idea. We grew up watching Dr. Strangelove. That was like one of the favorite movies of people from my generation, and the whole idea of the simultaneously horrifying and absurd side of war, that not only was war terrible and unsurvivable and completely against any positive human value, but it was also it tended to be run by people who were
crazy,
completely crazy, right? Like, yeah, the part of the myth of stability in the nuclear era was this idea that, well, it's all going to be run by responsible people, and there's never going to be an accident, and everybody's going to do the rational thing, and nobody's ever going to approve a launch because that would be irrational. Well, as we've seen, people they're not rational. I mean, if anything, this Putin situation is proof of that our leaders are not always rational people. They're also not always terribly bright. I always think of that line in All the President's Men, where Woodward is sitting talking to Deep Throat, and he's saying, you have to understand, these just aren't very bright guys, and things go out of hand, and that's kind of the reality of the way I see government, is that there's this image of them as these people that are brilliant and thorough and would never let something stupid happen. But the reality is that from what I've seen, the majority of people in government are very flawed and shallow, and you could easily have something really, really horrifying happen. And that's what's so worrying about this Ukraine situation. Sorry to ramble on about this, but it's just that it's brought us closer to a place where a really dumb decision could be catastrophic.
Another component of this is like when we talk about this amnesia, as a millennial growing up in the 90s, I remember like there was a lot of like we would look back and laugh at how absurd the Cold War was and how absurd neo-McCarthyism was. Like I remember like there's an episode of Roseanne where like they do like a 1950s episode, and we'd see this a lot, like a lot of satirizing of the 1950s about how just absurd the Cold War and nuclear annihilation and duck and cover, like how absurd all these things were. And somehow, just over the course of my life, we've gone from laughing at that absurdity to being right back in the middle of it. So it's just, it's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So our generation grew up sort of understanding that there's no upside to war, that everybody loses, right? That it's never a good thing. But there was so much propaganda after Vietnam, like, oh, we have to get over this malaise about war, right? Like, as if that was a problem, that people had come away from the Vietnam experience with negative feelings about war, and and so they worked tirelessly to get over to get the country over that feeling. Let's bring the pride back. Let's make America great again. Let's embrace leadership. And that's a lot of what this kind of neocon revival is all about. It's this idea of, projecting force and using force can be a good thing. It's something we should embrace and not be terrified of. And that's a significant development in the American psyche. Like we used to be, I think we had a healthy fear of it at one time, and now that fear has been whittled down to this, as we talked about at the beginning of this broadcast, to a pretty small space, at least publicly in the media. I think who knows how big it is in the actual population, but in the media world, there's just not a lot of that left.
Matt, as always, I really appreciate you being back on the show today. It's always an honor to speak with you. I think I have told you before, prior to me ever doing the show, you were a real journalistic hero of mine. So it's really been an honor to have you on the show 6 times. And for folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with you, how can they do that?
I'm at taibbi.substack.com. And PRIMO, thank you so much for those kind words. I really, it means a lot to me. I hope your show does great. You got that kind of Charlie Rose thing going on now. It looks really cool. No, thanks so much for having me on. It's terrific, and hope to talk to you again soon.